Hey, welcome to the Whole Bible Read Along for Week 8. Congratulations on the progress you've made. We're coming up almost on 2 months, and we're finishing our fourth big book of the Torah, the book of Numbers. Now, as Numbers closes, we sense that the settlement of the promised land that we've awaited is near. The tribes who are going to be on the east side of the Jordan are apportioned their land. There's an interesting thing that comes up where there are women in Israel whose fathers are gone, they don't have brothers, they don't have husbands, and the question is, what are they going to inherit? And there's a ruling that comes down. They're going to inherit the land. And the important thing to realize here is that this very much violates the traditions of the ancient Near East, but the message is there's a place for everyone in Israel as God is fulfilling his promise. No one is going to be excluded. Now, we go then from Numbers to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is an English word for this book that's derived from its Greek name, that means second law, because in this book, Moses reviews the law that God had given Israel, the terms of the covenant, before this new generation that has arisen in the wilderness is going in to receive the promised land. So he says, in essence, here are the terms of the covenant that God has given us, and here's our history in keeping those terms. Now, the history suggests that we're not going to keep them very well. And so in the big picture, Deuteronomy is warning Israel that if they don't keep the law, and that's what Deuteronomy expects, then the appropriate thing for God to do is what he's done throughout the Pentateuch. The punishments that God gives in the Torah are always the things that people ask for on themselves. Remember how the patriarchs are kind of punished with their own trickery on some occasions, like Jacob especially? Do we remember how when Pharaoh hardens his heart, then God just says, I'm just going to make your heart harder with more plagues that are going to just make worse this condition that you've chosen for yourself. Now with Israel, he said to the previous generation, you don't want to go into the land because you're afraid of the Canaanites? Fine, you can die in the wilderness. But he says to this new generation, if you go into the land and you don't keep the covenant, well, what should I do? I brought you out of captivity in a foreign land. I will take you out of the land and back into captivity. And so that's the scheme of the book of Deuteronomy. This is the scheme that's going to undergird a lot of the history of the Old Testament that we will read as we continue reading through the whole Bible. So the wilderness generation is really getting what it wants. It doesn't want to go into the land of Canaan, but the new generation is going to go in, but they have this warning. And of course, even Moses himself is excluded. So there's some great highlights in this part of Deuteronomy. Chapter 6 is one of the really important chapters of the Old Testament. It's here we see in chapter 5, just before it, we see the 10 Commandments repeated. And then chapter 6, verse 4 has what in Hebrew is called the Shema, which is the first word of this verse in Hebrew, meaning hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So that declaration that there is one and only one true God. And then the next verse, the great commandment, you will love the Lord with all your heart, all your mind, all of your strength. All of the texts that Jesus quotes in Matthew and Luke when he is tempted by the devil are found in the book of Deuteronomy. Man does not live by bread alone. Don't put God to the test. Worship God alone. All of those are reminders that Moses was giving to Israel of their prior failure in the wilderness. Jesus is then applying that to what Satan says to him. We see Jesus succeeding later in the Gospels where Israel had failed in the wilderness. Now, just something to be aware of. Some people make the mistake of reading Deuteronomy and the promises of Deuteronomy as general promises of prosperity as a reward for faith. But there are a couple of things to remember here. First of all, these are promises given to Israel as terms of their covenant, which has to do with safety and provision in the land that God has given them. This was not something that applies generally, but even more importantly than that, Israel's promise in the land is that God will care for them even when they are in situations of vulnerability, danger, and need. And that's the same promise that God has given to us. He doesn't forsake us. He doesn't abandon us, but he doesn't leave us to our own terms of what the good life is. He's trying to show us, just as he was trying to show Israel in the wilderness, even as he was trying to show Pharaoh, that the real life, the good life, is a life that depends on him in all of its troubles, all of its difficulties, all of its dangers, all of its deadliness. So as you read, think about the God, the one true God, whom we're called to love with all of our heart and all of our mind and all of our strength.